Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world that might smell a little less than fresh. You're stepping into the Victorian era, where the gleam of candlelight meets the stench of chamber pots, and where lace collars look crisp while armpits, well, not so much. Imagine it, soot in the air, horse dung on the streets, and you trying to stay clean with soap that costs almost as much as dinner. You probably won't survive this. At least, not with your sense of smell intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and the local time. Because nothing bonds us together like comparing who's trying to fall asleep at 2 a.m. and who's sneaking this in on a lunch break. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a narrow Victorian street, and the smell is the first thing that hits you. Coal smoke, horse manure, and rotting cabbage stew spilling out from a nearby lodging house window. You duck into a modest home where tonight's story begins. The lady of the house eyes the small hard lump of soap on the washstand as if it were gold. Soap isn't cheap, and it isn't used generously. You dip your hands into the basin of water, lukewarm, a little cloudy, and definitely recycled from yesterday's rinse. And you quickly realize that clean is a flexible concept. Victorian soap itself was rough, often made with animal fat and harsh alkalis that could sting the skin. Gentle lavender-scented versions existed, but those were luxuries for the wealthier classes. Ordinary people used what they could afford, which often left hands cracked and sore. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some households swore by carbolic soap, which carried a distinct medicinal odor, making you smell vaguely like a disinfected stable. Historians still argue whether the popularity of carbolic soap was more about health or about showing off that you could afford a supposedly modern product. Water was another ordeal. If you wanted a full bath, you didn't just turn a tap. You had to lug heavy buckets from a pump or cistern, then heat them over a fire. That meant a single bath could take hours of preparation and half a forest of coal. So the truth? Most people didn't bother. A quick wipe with a damp rag, what Victorians called a cat lick, was the daily standard. Imagine standing in front of a cracked mirror, swiping at your face, neck, and maybe underarms if you're feeling fancy. That's it. You're fresh for the day. You might be wondering, if soap and water were scarce, how often did people really bathe? The upper classes might soak once a week or every fortnight, especially if they had servants to haul the water. For the working poor, it was far less. Many went months without full immersion. Jokes circulated that a man should bathe 3 times in his life: when he was born, when he married, and when he died. You chuckle at the exaggeration, but not by much. Of course, the Victorians weren't oblivious to dirt. They knew it clung to their skin, their clothes, their hair. But they also lived in a world where grime was a constant companion. Imagine trudging through the London fog, so thick with soot particles that people described it as pea soup. After a day in that, a little soap and water wouldn't make much difference anyway. Here's a fun little fact to keep you awake. Some households experimented with odd substitutes when soap was scarce. Bran water was popular, where you boiled wheat husks and used the resulting liquid as a cleansing rinse. Others rubbed their skin with vinegar-soaked cloths, stinging but effective at masking odors, and in one extreme case, noted in a Victorian housekeeping guide, stale urine, rich in ammonia, was recommended as a fabric cleaner. Don't worry, we won't put that one to the test tonight. At the same time, a cultural shift was stirring. The mid-19th century was when medical science began linking cleanliness with health. Pamphlets spread the idea that regular washing wasn't just pleasant, but morally upright. To be clean was to be virtuous. To be dirty was to flirt with vice. Suddenly, That little sliver of soap became a badge of self-respect. But you, sitting by the fire, scrubbing at your face with tepid water, still know the limits. Soap stings, water is precious, and heating a bath is work. You dry your hands on a rough towel, still faintly damp from someone else's turn, and prepare to crawl into a bed where the sheets haven't seen fresh laundering in weeks. Hygiene here isn't a matter of luxury. It's a daily negotiation between effort, expense, and endurance. And as you drift deeper into this world, you realize soap and water are just the beginning. If you thought personal washing was tough, wait until you see where all that waste ends up. You step back out into the smoky twilight, clutching your collar against the damp air. It doesn't take long before the noise of a nearby street draws your attention. Wooden doors creak open, laughter spills out, and you catch the warm, steamy breath of a public washhouse. You decide to wander inside. Here, the world of communal bathing unfolds before you. Rows of wooden tubs line the floor, steam fogs the windows, and the air is thick with soap, sweat, and the faint tang of iron stoves heating water. Victorian public baths were built precisely because not everyone had the space or the means to heat a bath at home. By the 1840s, city reformers began opening public baths and washhouses to bring at least a semblance of cleanliness to the masses. You shuffle in line with laborers, washerwomen, and a few ragged children, each clutching a ticket for entry. The cheapest ticket buys you a cold plunge. Quick, shocking, and almost free. A pricier one allows hot water, but only a few gallons. You lower yourself into the wooden tub, knees poking out like a badly folded deck chair. And try not to notice the scratches and stains from the last bather. Hygiene, yes, but not privacy. Historians still argue whether people flocked to these public baths eagerly or resentfully. Some accounts suggest that bathhouses were bustling, noisy social centers, part laundromat, part gossip hub. Others claim many Victorians avoided them out of modesty or mistrust. After all, stripping down in a shared space didn't suit the era's prim sense of decency. You can almost hear the whispered disapproval. What if someone sees an ankle? And yet, these washhouses offered something precious, a rare chance to feel genuinely clean. Imagine, after weeks of cat-lick wipes, you finally soak in water that reaches your shoulders. The heat seeps into your muscles, and you almost forgive the smell of wet wool and soap flakes floating around you. Almost. Speaking of soap, here's a quirky tidbit. Some public baths provided their own rough soap blocks, chained to the wall like a medieval relic. Why? Because otherwise, they'd disappear into bathers' pockets faster than you can say, Victorian souvenir. Soap theft was a genuine problem. You can smile at the image of a stern bath attendant barking, "Hands off the soap, sir." Outside the bathing section, washerwomen attack laundry with ferocity. Heavy skirts hitched, arms plunged deep into basins. They scrub shirts against washboards until knuckles go raw. You notice the air here is thick with steam and gossip alike. Clotheslines crisscross overhead, dripping with linen. The rhythm of scrubbing is punctuated by sighs and muttered curses about husbands who soil collars faster than wives can bleach them. For you, sitting in that cramped tub, it's easy to imagine the ritual. Families planning their weekly bath trip as if it were a social appointment, coins counted carefully to afford the ticket. Some families even bathed in shifts, each member using the same water in order of importance. Father first, children last. By the time it's your turn, you might be better off staying dirty. Still, reformers touted these public facilities as signs of progress. Pamphlets described them as weapons against cholera and typhus. The belief grew that cleanliness was civic duty, not just personal comfort. That belief didn't always win out. Many poor families saw bathhouses as charity projects laced with condescension. You can almost hear a tired mother muttering, If the gentlemen in Parliament want us washed, maybe they should pay for coal in winter. And yet, these communal baths tell you something vital about Victorian life. They show how fragile cleanliness was, not a given, but a struggle balanced between pride, modesty, and sheer practicality. Here, soap and hot water are commodities, not assumptions. You climb out of your tub, shivering as cold air bites at damp skin, and pull clothes back on. You're cleaner, yes, but the relief feels temporary. Dirt and soot await you outside, as inevitable as the fog. And tomorrow, when the chamber pot fills and the cesspools overflow, you'll understand that staying clean was only half the battle. Getting rid of filth was the other. You step out from the bathhouse, hair damp, skin pink from the hot soak, and immediately your nose wrinkles. The streets remind you that whatever cleanliness you've just achieved won't last long. Horses clop by, leaving steaming reminders of their presence, and the gutters run dark with who knows what. You follow the stench toward the back of a tenement block where the true heart of Victorian hygiene, or the lack of it, waits: chamber pots and cesspools. Inside a cramped little room, barely larger than a closet, a porcelain bowl with a wooden lid sits tucked in the corner. That's the chamber pot, your most reliable nighttime companion. No flush, no plumbing. Just you and a bucket that has to be emptied come morning. You gingerly lift the lid, and the smell wafts up like a rude houseguest who refuses to leave. Families often shared a single pot, meaning its contents weren't just your own. And yes, if you lived in the poorest housing, you might share a communal privy with several neighbors, the result being, let's call it, a fragrant blend. Now, where does it all go? Out the window sometimes. You've heard the cliché of chamber pots dumped into the street with a shouted warning, "Gardy-loo." But by the Victorian age, that was mostly frowned upon. Instead, the contents got poured into cesspools or collected by night soilmen. Imagine trudging through the city after midnight, a lantern swinging while hauling buckets of human waste on your shoulders. Not glamorous, but absolutely essential. Quirky tidbit for you: some cesspools were so badly maintained that their wooden covers collapsed underfoot, swallowing unlucky pedestrians. Newspapers occasionally reported citizens disappearing into these stinking holes. And honestly, that's a nightmare you don't need at bedtime. Historians still argue whether the spread of disease in Victorian cities came more from contaminated water supplies or from these overflowing cesspits. Cholera epidemics swept through neighborhoods with terrifying speed, yet many officials clung to the idea of miasma, bad smells themselves, as the cause of illness. You pause leaning against a wall, wondering how anyone could believe the odor was the disease, rather than a symptom. But then again, breathing the air here, you start to feel a little queasy yourself. Plumbing innovations were creeping in, though. Wealthier households experimented with early flushing toilets, water closets, that connected to sewers. But these systems were notorious for poor design. S-traps dried out, allowing sewer gases to seep back into bedrooms. Imagine drifting off to sleep only to be woken by the sulfurous stench of methane rising from your fashionable new commode. Comforting, isn't it? For the poor, of course, none of that mattered. A chamber pot under the bed, a cesspool in the yard, and the hope that the night soil men came regularly. That was the reality. And in crowded London, where hundreds of families might rely on a single shared privy, filth piled up faster than anyone could remove it. You picture queues forming at dawn, neighbors glaring at one another as they waited their turn. Cleanliness, privacy, dignity, these were luxuries. Survival was the priority. Yet even here, in the thick of stench, there were rules. Social etiquette demanded chamber pots be tucked discreetly away, their contents whisked out of sight quickly. Ladies even carried decorated commode chairs, disguised as elegant furniture. You might sit in a parlor chair, sip tea, and never guess it doubled as a toilet. As you shuffle away, pulling your coat tighter against the damp night, the contrast lingers. Soap could make you feel momentarily clean. A public bath could refresh your body. But until London figured out what to do with its waste, the smell of the city itself betrayed the truth. Hygiene was only skin deep, and soon enough, that truth would erupt on a scale no politician could ignore. The summer of 1858 was waiting. Hot, foul, and unforgettable. The heat arrives first, pressing on your shoulders like a damp wool blanket. You drift along the Thames in the summer of 1858 and watch the river slacken, the water level drop, and the surface ripple with an iridescent sheen you absolutely do not want to investigate. Every chamber pot, every cesspool you just tiptoed past, eventually finds its way here. And now, the sun bakes that stew until the air turns into something you can practically chew. You cup a hand to your nose like you're doing a fancy wine tasting, notes of horse, cabbage, and regret, and decide this vintage is corked. Along the embankment, people tie vinegar-soaked cloths over their faces, hoping the sharp sting will drown out the reek. Shopkeepers splash chlorinated solutions across thresholds as if drawing protective circles. Clerks in Parliament fling open windows for a breeze and instantly slam them shut when the breeze arrives with malevolent intent. One mainstream fact you can't ignore. That summer becomes known, officially and forever, as the Great Stink, so overpowering that it interrupts the work of government and forces a very expensive solution. You picture lawmakers in starched collars, eyes watering, making policy with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. Civilization meets sewage, and sewage wins the opening round. You wander past the Houses of Parliament and hear rumors that draperies have been treated with chloride of lime, an early disinfectant, in a losing battle against the odor. Is that fully accurate for every room? Historians still argue whether curtains were truly soaked throughout, or whether the story became a symbolic shorthand for a desperate building trying not to gag. Either way, the symbolism works. The state is literally perfuming its windows while the river below ferments. You pause on Westminster Bridge and look down at Father Thames, once painted as a benevolent old man, now imagined by caricaturists as a skeletal figure offering bottles marked cholera. The miasma theory, the idea that disease floats in bad air, still holds much of the public's imagination. And to be fair, breathing this haze feels like a health risk. You remember the chamber pots of last night, the cesspools behind tenements, the overworked night soil men. All of it converges here like a city-sized confession. Your stomach flutters. Maybe don't picture stew for dinner. Then comes the pivot. Engineers and reformers seize the moment. Plans long discussed finally gain momentum, and a certain chief engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, steps into the spotlight with a grand design to catch the city's waste before it hits the river and move it far downstream. Intercepting sewers will sweep along both sides of the Thames. Monumental pumping stations will heave the flow onward. Elegant embankments will double as flood defenses, roads, and utility corridors. You don't have to memorize the map to appreciate the scale. It's like giving a city a brand new set of arteries, so the heart no longer pumps poison into its own veins. Sleepy aside, you wish your kitchen sink had this level of planning. You follow surveyors as they drive stakes into the mud, eyes narrowed against the sun's glare. Workmen measure, dig, shore, and rivet. The clank of iron and the thud of pile drivers blend with gull calls and distant carriage wheels. It's all oddly soothing if you ignore the smell, like a metronome for progress. A quirky tidbit catches your ear from a foreman. When calculating pipe diameters, Bazalgette reportedly doubled his estimates for safety, a habit of over-engineering that later generations would bless each time the population swelled. Victorian belt and suspenders, if you will, when your city's belt is made of brick and your suspenders are wrought iron. Still, the politics swirl. Contracts, costs, and pride mingle with the fumes. Historians still argue whether the decisive shove came from the Great Stink's immediate assault on Parliament or from years of cholera outbreaks, reform campaigns, and the gradual acceptance of waterborne disease theories. You can almost hear the debate in gentle academic tones. Was it pain, fear, or finally good science that made the purse strings snap? You, holding your vinegar rag like a sad party favor? Vote for all of the above. As foundations sink and brickwork rises, Londoners begin to glimpse the outlines of a cleaner future. You stroll to a pumpworks whose architecture looks suspiciously grand. Cast iron columns painted like a Gothic arcade, a cathedral of sewage where pistons glide with priestly solemnity. The Victorians, it seems, loved to wrap utility in ornament. There's something endearing about giving waste removal the dignity of a palace. You imagine a plaque, dedicated to the swift departure of unpleasantness. The river does not become a fragrant stream overnight. Construction takes years, and the city keeps growing, always one step ahead of yesterday's solution. You feel the tug of war between hope and habit. Residents still buy nosegays of flowers to ward off foul air. Chemists still hawk disinfectant powders with names that sound more confident than they smell. Perfumers enjoy a brisk trade in eau de masking. Agent. You catch yourself wondering if carbolic soap, with its medical tang, would be an improvement right now, or just add a top note of hospital to the bouquet. Third joke for the night. You'd settle for freshly baked bread, but the Thames is more of a notes of old boots and existential dread situation. As you walk, the heat finally softens with evening. The air is still heavy, but the wind stirs, and for a moment, you can make out something else. The future. A future where taps run and drains carry waste away without drama. Where cat licks become quick refreshers between real baths rather than the main event. Where the city's heartbeat isn't drowned out by the slosh of its own refuse. The Great Stink, for all its misery, concentrates the Victorian mind like a strong cup of coffee, which, incidentally, very few aristocrats would drink by the riverside this summer unless they're fans of immersive tasting. You lean on the stone railing and let your eyelids lower. The water glugs against the piers. A barge creaks past, piled with bricks destined for embankments that will tame this edge of the city. Somewhere, a clerk sharpens a pen to sign off on another tranche of funds. Somewhere else, a child fills a bucket and asks where to pour it. And a mother says, "Soon, love, soon there will be a better place." The smell is still here, sure, but so is the blueprint for change. When you finally turn away from the river, you carry the scene with you. The sun, the sickly shimmer, the spectacles of gentlemen fogging as they wipe their eyes, the practical genius of a plan that turns revulsion into infrastructure. Tomorrow, you'll wake to the same air, maybe a touch kinder if the breeze shifts, and in the years ahead, the city will learn to breathe. For tonight, though, you close the window and slide a damp cloth under the sill, a small ritual in a summer of large ones. The lesson lingers. In Victorian life, cleanliness isn't just soap and water. It's engineering, politics, and the stubborn refusal to let a river become a graveyard of good intentions. You leave the river behind and wander into a quieter lane, the scent of sewage replaced by something chalky and faintly metallic. A small apothecary shop beckons with shelves of powders, brushes, and curious bottles. Tonight, hygiene shifts from the body to the mouth. You lean closer and discover how Victorians kept their teeth in check, or at least tried to. On the counter, you find tiny tins labeled tooth powder. Forget modern tubes of minty toothpaste. Instead, Victorians dipped a damp brush into gritty powders made from crushed chalk, charcoal, ground brick dust, or even cuttlefish bone. Yes, ground-up shellfish skeletons. That's a smile straight from the sea. A pinch on the brush, a vigorous scrub, and suddenly, you're tasting something halfway between a sandbox and a coal cellar. Mint flavoring existed, but usually for the wealthier buyer. Ordinary folk endured the grit. Here's a mainstream fact. Dental care was not widespread or sophisticated for most Victorians. Tooth decay was rampant, and many people lost their teeth by middle age. False teeth, often made of porcelain or ivory, were status symbols, though they squeaked when you talked and clicked alarmingly if you laughed too hard. You picture yourself at a polite dinner, dentures slipping as you try to bite into a tough piece of beef, and wonder if dignity was ever truly possible. A quirky tidbit floats to mind. In the earlier part of the century, some dentures were made with actual human teeth, often taken from battlefield corpses. Waterloo teeth, they were called. Gruesome souvenirs, repurposed for a wealthy Londoner's smile. By the High Victorian period, porcelain was more common, but the phrase lingered in dark humor. You find yourself pressing your tongue nervously against your own teeth, grateful for the inventions of later centuries. As for toothbrushes, they existed, but the bristles were often made from boar hair and set into bone or ivory handles. The bristles splayed quickly, and hygiene experts today would faint at the thought of how rarely they were replaced. Families sometimes shared a single brush, passing it along like a communal pen. You give a theatrical shudder at the idea of brushing with someone else's bristles. Victorian intimacy at its most questionable. Historians still argue whether most people actually brushed daily or if oral hygiene was reserved for special occasions. Some evidence suggests many simply rinsed their mouths with water or rubbed teeth with a rag and a bit of salt. It's possible, then, that for all the powders sold, the average Victorian smile was more stained than sparkling. Step back outside and you notice the contradictions. Wealthy Victorians displayed gleaming false teeth, polished like pearls, while working-class mouths told stories of decay, pain, and extraction. Barber surgeons and traveling dentists offered quick solutions. Yank the tooth out, no anesthetic, and hope infection doesn't follow. You can almost hear the muffled screams from behind a curtained booth in a fairground where itinerant dentists promised cheap extractions. Still, a cultural connection grew between cleanliness and morality. Having neat teeth, real or fake, was a marker of self-respect. Magazines offered advice on rinsing with myrrh or vinegar solutions. Some suggested scrubbing the gums with a mixture of soot and honey. Effective? Debatable. Sweet? Ironically dangerous. You smirk at the contradiction. Using sugar's cousin to fight cavities is like fighting fire with gasoline. As you walk on, you picture a Victorian family gathered at bedtime. Father dips the family brush into a tin of powder, scrubs quickly, spits into the fire, then hands the brush to the next in line. The candle sputters, children yawn, and the household prepares to sleep with the day's soot and sugar still clinging stubbornly to molars. Hygiene here isn't about freshness. It's about doing just enough to feel proper in a world where decay was nearly inevitable. And as you close the apothecary door behind you, you realize your smile might not survive this era intact. But don't worry. There are wigs, powders, and plenty of perfume waiting to distract attention from your teeth. You leave the apothecary, lips still tingling from that imaginary scrub of chalk and charcoal, and step into a barber's shop where the air smells of oil, soap, and hair clippings. Victorian hair care awaits you, part ritual, part improvisation, part battlefield against grease and lice. A customer sits beneath the barber's steady hand, head tilted back as pomade is worked into his scalp. The mixture glistens, thick and sticky, a concoction of bear fat, lard, or beeswax, blended with scent to mask the animal notes. You catch a whiff. Rose, maybe, or something vaguely medicinal. It's meant to keep hair in place, glossy and dignified, but it leaves pillows stained and collars shiny. You realize quickly that Victorian hair wasn't just styled. It was preserved like a candle, dipped in tallow. Mainstream fact, washing hair with water and soap was rare. It was thought to strip oils and weaken strands. Instead, hair was brushed, relentlessly. Ladies were told to run combs and brushes through their locks 100 strokes a day. The brushing redistributed natural oils, giving hair a sheen, though it also spread any little visitors living there. Yes, lice and nits were constant companions. Quirky tidbit: some Victorians wore nightcaps, not just for warmth, but to keep bugs from spreading between spouses, or to contain hair greased with treatment oils overnight. You imagine rolling over to face your beloved, both of you rustling in matching caps like two cautious mushrooms in bed. Romantic? Maybe not. And then there were wigs. Not the towering powdered constructions of the 18th century, but subtler hairpieces. Men used them to disguise baldness. Women employed hair pads and rats, rolls of old hair collected from brushes, to bulk out elaborate styles. You picture the irony: brushing 100 strokes to gather fallen strands, then sewing those strands into cushions that made the hairstyle look fuller. Recycling at its most intimate. Historians still argue how often ordinary Victorians actually washed their hair. Some diaries hint at monthly rinses with herbal infusions, rosemary, chamomile, or nettles, while others imply long stretches without any washing at all. The truth probably varied by class, region, and season. Imagine winter in a drafty house. Would you really dump cold water on your scalp just for vanity? Probably not. You watch a lady in the corner unpack a box of powders. Hair powders, sometimes starch-based, sometimes tinted, were sprinkled to absorb grease and dull shine. They could lighten dark hair or disguise thinning patches. Today you'd call it dry shampoo. Back then, it was just another weapon against oil and odor. The powder puffs into the air, coating her shoulders in a fine white mist. She coughs delicately, then smiles, satisfied. Of course, hair wasn't only about cleanliness. It was a statement of morality and identity. Women's long, glossy hair symbolized virtue, while men's sideburns or beards carried messages about class, politics, and masculinity. A thick beard might suggest rugged health, or just a man hiding the fact he hadn't washed his chin in weeks. You stroll past a dressing table and notice bottles of hair tonic. Advertisements promised to cure baldness, strengthen roots, or banish dandruff forever. Many contained alcohol, oils, and herbal extracts. Some included outright poisons, like lead acetate. You chuckle at the fine print. For external use only, though in this era, even external use could shorten your life. Imagine yourself sitting in that chair, pomade slicked, brush strokes counting upward like a metronome, scalp tingling with tonic. You leave smelling faintly of lavender, faintly of pig fat, and strongly of effort. Tomorrow, you'll brush again. Next week, maybe rinse with herbs if the water is warm. And if baldness threatens, perhaps you'll tuck a discreet wig beneath your hat and hope nobody tugs too hard in greeting. Hair, you realize, is less about hygiene than illusion. Keep it shiny. Keep it in place. Keep up appearances, even if the lice are still marching under the gloss. And when the illusion slips, well, there's always perfume, powder, and polite society's talent for pretending not to notice. You step out of the barber's shop, scalp tingling with phantom pomade, and follow the sound of wooden tubs sloshing in the distance. It's laundry day, though calling it a day undersells the ordeal. For Victorians, washing clothes wasn't a quick cycle on a machine. It was a backbreaking ritual that consumed hours, sometimes days, and left you with blistered fingers and aching arms. You enter a narrow yard behind a row of cottages. Steam rises in thick clouds from great copper pots, and the sharp tang of lye and soap greets you like a slap. Women stoop over washboards, plunging garments into boiling water, then scrubbing as if their lives depend on it. Which, in a way, they do. Clean linen was the one thing even the poorest families tried to maintain. Dirt-streaked faces might be tolerated, but stained collars or yellowed undergarments marked you as truly degraded. Mainstream fact: Monday was traditionally laundry day. Entire neighborhoods clattered with the sound of tubs, mangle wheels, and wringers. It wasn't just custom, it was practicality. Starting the week with clean clothes, however few, was a mark of discipline and respectability. By Tuesday, lines of shirts and sheets flapped in the soot-heavy breeze. Drying slowly in air that was never entirely clean, you bend closer to watch a woman sprinkling blue powder into a tub. That's laundry bluing, a trick to make yellowed fabric appear whiter by tinting it faintly blue. A quirky tidbit for you: some early bluing agents were made from ground-up indigo or even the mineral smalt, a form of cobalt glass. The science was shaky, but the effect worked well enough. You smile at the irony. Victorians weren't necessarily cleaner, just better at optical illusions. And oh, the smells. Boiling lye singes your nostrils, while damp wool gives off a stubborn barnyard note. Mixed with coal smoke, it's a perfume no modern candlemaker would dare reproduce. You joke to yourself, "Eau de Monday with base notes of ash and despair." Historians still argue whether laundry was primarily a woman's domain or if professional laundresses played a bigger role in urban areas. Diaries suggest many working-class households sent laundry out when possible, while middle-class women oversaw washing at home as proof of domestic virtue. Both, however, carried a heavy price. Washerwomen's hands were perpetually red, cracked, and raw from caustic soaps. Some even lost fingernails from repeated contact with harsh chemicals. You notice a hulking wooden contraption, the mangle. Two enormous rollers squeeze water from linens as a crank is turned. Children sometimes helped with this, straining against the wheel, their small bodies bent like cogs in the household machine. The thump of the rollers echoes rhythmically, and you imagine it as a kind of weary music, the anthem of every Victorian street on wash day. But laundry wasn't only about fabric, it was about class. Clean shirts meant you had enough linen to rotate while one set was laundered. Working men often owned just one or two shirts. Stains were inevitable, but a freshly blued collar could signal respectability. Meanwhile, the wealthy owned dozens, sometimes handed off to servants who wrestled them through endless cycles of soaking, scrubbing, starching, and pressing. A single gentleman's starched shirt front might require hours of labor invisible to its wearer. And pressing, there's another ordeal. Heavy flat irons heated on coals were wielded like weapons against wrinkles. Each one cooled quickly. So a row of irons sat heating while the laundress swapped them in and out. You can hear the hiss of hot metal against damp cloth, smell the faint scorch where fabric met flame. One careless second, and a week's work could be ruined with a single brown mark. As you lean against the fence, you realize that Victorian laundry wasn't just work. It was endurance sport. No detergent pods, no spin cycles, no delicate setting. Just sweat, lye, boiling water, bruised knuckles, and the endless pursuit of clothes that looked, at least for a few days, as though life wasn't as dirty as it felt. You take one last look at the lines of steaming sheets, lifting gently in the smoky breeze, and wonder if they'll ever truly be clean. The coal dust will be back by morning, the sweat stains by nightfall. But for now, they billow like pale flags of victory, a fleeting triumph over grime. You step away from the laundry yard, still sneezing from the tang of lye, and into a sitting room where the air is sweeter, though not naturally. Here you discover the arsenal of scents and powders Victorians used to fight the inevitable truth: people smelled. If daily baths were rare and laundry an exhausting ordeal, then perfume, colognes, and powders were the secret weapons that made society bearable, or at least tolerable. On the dressing table lies a row of bottles, cut glass flacons filled with lavender water, rose oil, bergamot, and cologne imported from Germany. One mainstream fact: Victorians loved eau de cologne. Originally developed in the 18th century, it remained fashionable well into the 19th, sold as both a fragrance and a supposed health tonic. A dab on the wrist masked body odor. A sip in water was said to cure faintness. Yes, people actually drank their perfume. You wince at the thought. You pick up a little box of powder. Pale and shimmering, it's meant for the face, an elegant finish, softening the complexion. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some powders contained lead or arsenic. Ads promised porcelain skin while slowly poisoning the user. You picture a young woman dusting her cheeks, coughing delicately, then brushing off the fatigue as a sign of refinement. Beauty at a price, literally toxic. Historians still argue whether Victorians genuinely believed in the medical value of perfumes, or if it was mostly a polite fiction. The miasma theory, which held that foul smells caused disease, made perfumes seem like protective shields. Scent wasn't just vanity, it was survival. A gentleman might carry a pomander, a little ball filled with spices or herbs, to sniff when passing through crowded streets. Was it health protection or social theater? The truth probably lies somewhere between. You lean closer to a powder puff and accidentally inhale a cloud. Suddenly, your tongue tastes chalky, your nose tingles, and you sneeze so hard you nearly knock over a bottle of rose oil. A soft chuckle escapes. You'd never survive a Victorian beauty routine without drowning in your own cosmetics. Perfume wasn't limited to bodies. Rooms were fumigated with burning pastilles, small cones of incense that promised to purify the air. Curtains were sprayed with lavender water, handkerchiefs soaked in cologne. Even letters might be perfumed before sending, so that a whiff of rose greeted the recipient before a word was read. In a world of chamber pots and coal smoke, every little trick mattered. But scents also signaled class. The wealthy could afford imported oils and fashionable blends, while the poor relied on herbs, vinegar rinses, or cheap floral waters that faded within the hour. Lavender, especially, became the scent of the middle class, cheap enough to buy, strong enough to mask, respectable enough to impress visitors. You imagine an entire street filled with the same faint lavender note, rising above the smell of rotting refuse. And don't forget clothing. After all the brutal laundry of last section, garments were often perfumed before wearing. Starched collars might be sprinkled with violet water, dresses lined with sachets of dried rose petals or orris root. A well-dressed lady moving through a parlor carried a little breeze of powder and perfume, masking the reality that beneath the silk, her skin hadn't seen soap and water in a week. The contradictions are sharp. Victorians prided themselves on civility and refinement, yet behind the polished exterior lay sweat, grime, and the faint sting of arsenic powder. You can almost hear the unspoken rule: if you can't be clean, at least smell like you tried. As you step back from the dressing table, the mingled scents cling to your clothes. Lavender, coal smoke, rose, sweat. It's a bouquet both elegant and uneasy, like Victorian life itself. You cough once, smile faintly, and remind yourself, appearances were everything. Tomorrow the perfume will fade, the powders will smudge, but tonight at least you smell presentable. You step from the perfume-clouded sitting room into a hallway lined with framed proverbs, and one of them catches your eye. Cleanliness is next to godliness. It hangs there like a polite ultimatum. In the Victorian mind, soap isn't just soap. It's character in a cake. You smooth your sleeves, suddenly aware that your last cat lick might not pass a spiritual audit. Somewhere a clock chimes, and you follow the sound into a parlor where a family gathers for evening prayers. Hands folded, collars starched, shoes buffed, until the reflection might shame you into virtue. The father clears his throat and reads from a tract about order, sobriety, and bodily purity. The message is gentle but firm. A clean home keeps out not just disease, but temptation. You nod along, feeling surprisingly judged by a dust mote. Here's a mainstream fact to tuck behind your ear like a sprig of lavender. The phrase, cleanliness is next to godliness, popularized by John Wesley in the 18th century, becomes a Victorian chorus line, repeated in sermons, schoolrooms, and housekeeping manuals, especially the kind that advise you to rise early, make the bed square, and polish your day until it squeaks. You wander toward the kitchen, where order itself seems to be boiled and bottled. Shelves of labeled jars, floor scrubbed to a dull shine, copper pots reflecting the candlelight like halos. This is sanctity by scouring. Mrs. Beaton sort of sanctity, you think, the kind that insists a household should run like a small fragrant kingdom. You remember the laundry bluing from earlier and realize it isn't just chemistry, it's catechism. If your collar gleams, your conscience must be doing fine. Light joke 1. You consider sprinkling bluing on your soul. But the instructions are vague. The moral code extends to bodies. Cold morning ablutions are touted as bracing exercises in willpower. A quick splash from a basin is less about removing dirt than about rehearsing virtue. You can almost hear a clergyman praising the discipline of a dawn rinse, tempering the flesh with water that could extinguish a forge. Hydropathy, the water cure craze, rides this wave of righteousness. Patients submit to cold douches, wraps, and plunges not only for their health, but for their habits. It's supposed to clarify the mind, steady the appetite, and sand the rough edges off your morals. You shiver just thinking about it, which, you're told, means it's working. Modesty, too, has a housekeeping manual. You step outside to the seaside, where wind whips at parasols and the gulls wheel like ribbon cutters at a grand opening. Bathing machines, the famous little huts on wheels, line the shore. Women climb inside and are rolled down to the water, emerging under a canvas awning to take the cure with dignity intact. Quirky tidbit incoming. At some resorts, a professional dipper, often a stout matron with arms of iron, literally hauls bathers into the surf and dunks them decisively, while a small flag on the machine signals when the occupant is in and when the beach may gaze again. Privacy by semaphore. You salute, respectfully amused. Light joke 2. You briefly imagine requesting one gentle dunk and a side of hot cocoa, but the dipper looks like she serves only the truth. Modesty polices language as well. In polite company, the word leg may become limb, and you are advised to keep ankles from pulling focus like unruly extras in a drawing room scene. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly blushed at uncovered piano legs, or whether that story is a later parody of prudery. Either way, you study the instrument before you and notice its curvaceous carvings wearing wooden modesty panels like furniture corsets. The room seems to approve. Schools and charities fold moral hygiene into their missions. At the ragged school down the lane, a teacher lines children up, inspects hands and faces, and hands out tiny cakes of soap like diplomas. Cleanliness, the lesson goes, opens doors. Jobs, respect, salvation. You watch a boy scrub at a smudge until the skin glows pink. He smiles shyly when the teacher nods. A small victory, but a telling one. In a world where water is hard-won and soap stings, achieving presentable is a triumph of will and pennies. Somewhere behind you, a reformer in a sturdy bonnet whispers the era's equation. Dirt is a moral hazard. Polish is promise. And yet the arithmetic gets complicated. You remember the great stink when the river broadcast every household secret under the sun. If cleanliness equals goodness, what do you call a clean collar in a city that still reeks? Historians still argue whether Victorian moral hygiene genuinely improved public health, or mostly enforced middle-class norms on bodies that couldn't afford them. Perhaps it's both. The sermons scold, the engineers dig, and between them a city inches toward drains that work and habits that help. You stand at that intersection, a crossroads labeled soap on one post and sewer on the other, and admit the road to progress needed both signboards. Back in the sitting room, a mother adjusts her daughter's dress to ensure every hook and eye holds, every hem hangs to regulation. Modesty measures everything: neckline, sleeve, the slope of a hat. You recall the arsenic-laced face powder from earlier and suppress a cough. The performance of purity sometimes poisons the performer. The father extinguishes a candle and opens a window. Even the act of airing out the bedclothes carries a moral halo, fresh air as a tonic for the soul. A draft creeps in, and you tuck your shawl tighter, conveniently pure, but undeniably chilly. The moral map stretches into the city's entertainment and vices too. Temperance meetings praise the clarity of a life unmarred by drink, and you half expect someone to propose that ale be blued like linen until it looks as sober as it should taste. Prostitutes are discussed in coded tones. Vice societies distribute pamphlets like paper shields, and the language of purity wraps bodies in long paragraphs where simple compassion might do more work. You tiptoe around the edges of these conversations, keeping our tone PG-13, and notice the paradox. A culture keen on modest silence often ties itself in knots when it needs plain words most. Still, there's comfort in the rhythms. Morning wipes and evening prayers. Sunday promenades in clothes that scratch but signal respectability. Seaside dunks orchestrated by flags and formidable matrons. A weekly battle against grime staged like a liturgy. You find yourself soothed by the order, even as you side-eye the judgments. Light joke 3. You award yourself a moral gold star for not tripping over the modesty screen, which, frankly, looks eager to judge. Night gathers again. The proverb in the hall glows dully in the lamplight, and you think of all the ways this era tries to polish life until it shines. Soap, sermons, starch, and the stubborn hope that goodness might be laundered into being. You've seen the masks, powders, perfumes, the muscles, cold baths, hydropathy, and the machines, bathing huts and mangles, that keep the show running. You also know what's offstage: the chamber pot, the coal dust, the ache in a washerwoman's hands. You climb the stairs, brushing a hand along the banister, worn smooth by other hands that also reached for better days. In your room, you fold your clothes with military neatness, lay your boots square, and set a small cake of soap beside the basin like a pledge. Cleanliness here is part faith, part theater, part survival. You blow out the lamp and let the dark settle, wondering whether your collar will pass tomorrow's inspection, and whether the river, somewhere beyond the rooftops, is learning to breathe a little easier. Morning finds you wandering through a marketplace, eyes drawn not to apples or bread, but to rows of glass bottles glinting in the sunlight. Their labels promise miracles. Dr. Smith's invigorating bath tonic, Mrs. Allen's hair reviver, universal cure all elixir. In the Victorian world, quack cures thrive, often cloaked in the language of hygiene. If soap was a badge of morality, then swallowing a dubious tonic was a badge of modern progress, or so the advertising claimed. You tip one bottle gently and watch a syrupy liquid cling to the glass. The vendor beams, assuring you it cleanses the blood, strengthens the stomach, and even sweetens the breath. You raise an eyebrow because the ingredients list is vague at best. Alcohol, certainly. Laudanum, maybe. Herbs of mysterious provenance, definitely. The tonic smells faintly of peppermint and menace. Here's a mainstream fact. The 19th century saw a booming trade in patent medicines. They weren't patented in the strict legal sense, but branded with catchy names and sold through newspapers and traveling shows. With limited regulation, makers could claim almost anything. Cleanse your liver, clear your skin, banish bad odors, restore youthful vigor, all for a shilling a bottle. You imagine desperate families plagued by sickness and stink, clinging to the hope that a swallow of something sweet might make life bearable. And then beyond the marketplace, you hear another splash of water. Mineral springs, hydropathic spas, seaside resorts, they're bustling. Quirky tidbit: some Victorians swore by bathing in beer or milk for health and beauty, while others booked seaside dipping sessions, believing salt water cured everything from melancholy to constipation. Entire towns thrived on the notion that submerging yourself in chilly waves or sulfurous baths was the path to wellness. Historians still argue whether hydropathy was genuine medicine or just a fashionable placebo. Some credit it with encouraging hygiene habits. After all, at least people were bathing. Others dismiss it as another layer of quackery dressed in scientific jargon. You lower yourself into an imagined mineral bath, the water reeking faintly of rotten eggs. And wonder, is your skin healthier or just smellier in a new direction? You drift through the spa, past patients wrapped in wet sheets like burritos. Attendants promise that sweating out impurities will cure everything from headaches to moral weakness. One gentleman dunks repeatedly in icy water, each plunge a test of resolve. He emerges gasping, blue-lipped, but convinced he's purchased an extra decade of life. You almost applaud his optimism before sneezing from the sulfur haze. The same faith in water seeps into the household. Pamphlets urge daily rinses, tonics recommend mineral water as a drink, and advertisements show cherubic children sipping effervescent health salts. You peek at the fine print and spot magnesium sulfate, Epsom salts, dissolving into bubbly drinks. It's both laxative and miracle cure, depending on who's selling. You resist the urge to laugh too loudly. After all, this is marketed as refinement, not indigestion. Waiting to happen, back in the city. You picture housewives storing little bottles in cupboards, children sneaking spoonfuls of cherry-flavored syrup, men raising glasses of medicated port before bed. Health, hygiene, and habit blur until you can't tell where soap ends and snake oil begins. Light joke: if one more tonic promises eternal youth, you'll start bottling your bathwater and selling it as authentic Victorian essence. You linger at the edge of a seaside spa, watching the sunset. Patients in shawls stroll slowly, breathing invigorating sea air, noses pinched against the brine. Somewhere a band plays polite waltzes, while doctors in frock coats prescribe another dip or another draft. The scene feels both sincere and absurd, caught between desperation for health and delight in performance. And as the waves lap at your boots, you realize the lesson. Victorians didn't just fight dirt with soap, they fought it with faith. Faith in powders, faith in perfumes, faith in tonics that promised more than they delivered. For every genuine advance, there was a glittering bottle of nonsense ready to swallow the coins of the hopeful. Tomorrow, you'll turn to the children of this world, their tangled hair, their stiff collars, their endless battles with lice and cold baths. But tonight, the taste of peppermint-tinged menace still lingers on your tongue, reminding you that hygiene in the Victorian age was as much theater as truth. You leave the seaside spa behind and follow the chatter of children down a cobbled lane. Their laughter is shrill, high-pitched, then broken by sudden crying. Childhood in Victorian Britain was never spotless, and hygiene for the youngest members of society was often harsher than for their parents. You crouch low at eye level, and the world suddenly looks bigger, dirtier, more overwhelming. A little boy scratches at his head furiously, his hair matted and dull. Lice were constant companions for Victorian children, so common that combs with tiny fine-set teeth became household essentials. You imagine sitting cross-legged while your mother drags a metal-knit comb through your hair, each stroke tugging painfully, each crackle of resistance promising another tiny invader. A mainstream fact here: school inspectors often checked children for lice, sending the worst cases home or, more humiliating, making them endure public combing sessions in front of classmates. Respectability, it seemed, began at the scalp. In the corner of a crowded rooming house, you see a basin filled with icy water. Children line up, one by one, shivering as their faces are scrubbed with rough soap. Baths were rare, but the ritual of cold morning washes was enforced in some schools and institutions. A child protests, feet stamping against the chill. The matron scolds, "It will build your character." Quirky tidbit: some Victorians genuinely believed cold water toughened the spirit, warding off laziness and moral weakness. You wince at the goosebumps rising on the little arms. Character building or not? Historians still argue whether these strict routines genuinely improved children's health or merely enforced adult ideals of discipline. Some evidence suggests mortality rates stayed stubbornly high, despite the emphasis on cold baths and harsh scrubbing. Others claim that at least basic hygiene reduced outbreaks of lice and skin disease. You weigh both sides as another child plunges reluctantly into the basin, teeth chattering in protest. And then there's clothing. Starched collars, stiff pinafores, stockings that pinched. All of it was meant to signal respectability. But for a child, it meant itchy discomfort. Imagine sweating through summer lessons with a wool waistcoat buttoned to the throat, or playing hopscotch in shoes stiff enough to blister your heels. Laundry day did its best to restore these outfits, but sweat and soot worked faster than soap. A child might look pristine at Sunday service, but by Monday afternoon, the grime returned like clockwork. You wander into a schoolroom. Children sit in rows, ink stains on their fingers, hair roughly parted from the morning's combing. On the teacher's desk sits a tin of tooth powder and a shared brush. The idea of communal brushing, passed from one small mouth to another, makes you grimace. Yet in an era when tooth decay was rampant, even this was considered progress. And of course, punishment lurks close by. A child who arrived dirty might be shamed, scolded, or even beaten for idleness. You picture a ragged boy hauled to the front of the class, hands examined for grime under his nails, cheeks rubbed raw with soap as an example to the others. Cleanliness was never just about dirt. It was about discipline, conformity, and obedience. Light joke to soften the sting. You imagine yourself as a Victorian child, asked to scrub with a bar of lye soap the size of a brick. You'd probably drop it on your toe and count that as character building too. And yet, childhood hygiene wasn't entirely bleak. Middle-class families, influenced by new medical advice, sometimes embraced gentler routines. Warm baths on Sundays, scented powders to keep babies comfortable, little toothbrushes carved from bone handles. Advertisements even targeted mothers, promising that a clean, sweet-smelling child reflected her virtue. Behind every scrubbed cheek, you sense the weight of maternal pride and pressure. Still, the gap between classes was enormous. Poor children scraped through with lice combs and cold basins, while wealthy children soaked in porcelain tubs, dried with soft towels, and dabbed with lavender water before bed. The difference wasn't just smell, it was survival. Cleanliness could mean fewer illnesses, more opportunities, longer lives. As night gathers, you watch the children curl into narrow beds, blankets rough, air thick with coal smoke. Some sleep soundly despite the lice. Others stir, scratching, dreaming of soap and sunshine. You tuck the image away. Childhood in the Victorian age, scrubbed raw at dawn, sent to bed itchy at dusk. Carrying hygiene not as comfort, but as a lesson. Tomorrow, you'll step out again, this time into the factories, the kitchens, the mansions, to see how class carved the great divide in cleanliness itself. You leave the schoolroom behind and follow the trail of coal smoke into the streets, where the gulf between rich and poor becomes impossible to ignore. Hygiene in the Victorian age was not one experience, but two parallel worlds, separated by money, space, and sheer luck. Tonight, you walk between them, boots crunching in factory soot on one side, polished leather shoes clicking in Mayfair on the other. On your left, The working class quarters. Families of 6 or more cram into single rooms, their walls damp with condensation, their windows painted shut by grime. The floorboards creak over a cesspit below. Water comes from a pump down the street, often shared by dozens of households. You watch a mother lug a bucket home, her skirts trailing in the muck. Soap, if she has it, will be rationed carefully. Half for laundry, half for dishes, and maybe a sliver for the children's hands before Sunday service. A mainstream fact: in 1842, Edwin Chadwick's sanitary report revealed that the laboring poor lived in conditions where life expectancy was shockingly lower, sometimes by 20 years, than that of their wealthier counterparts. Dirt wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. On your right, you glimpse the grand houses of the wealthy. Brass taps glimmer, water flows from cisterns, and porcelain basins line tiled bathrooms. Servants scurry with steaming pails, filling marble tubs where their masters soak in rose-scented water. Carpets are beaten daily, sheets pressed with lavender, chamber pots discreetly emptied by unseen hands. You pause in the doorway of a dining hall, where gentlemen in gleaming collars sip wine, their hands soft from soap that never stings their skin. It's a different planet, though only a carriage ride away. Quirky tidbit: some upper-class families owned household manuals that instructed servants on exactly how to clean their masters. One guidebook recommended brushing a lady's hair for 20 minutes every evening, not because she couldn't, but because the act of being groomed was itself a display of privilege. You imagine hiring someone just to count out your brush strokes, and the thought makes you chuckle softly. Meanwhile, back in the alleys, working men finish 12-hour shifts at the factory, skin blackened with soot, lungs raw from dust. They trudge home, wipe their faces with damp cloths, and collapse onto straw mattresses. Baths are rare, but sweat is constant. Their children carry coal dust on their cheeks. Their wives scrub at shirts that will never truly be white again. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with cleanliness was primarily about health or about reinforcing class boundaries. Was soap really about fighting cholera, or about signaling that you weren't one of them? A polished collar could open doors, while dirt might slam them shut. Respectability became as important as hygiene itself, if not more so. You walk deeper into the mansion district. Chandeliers glitter above polished floors, perfumes hover in the air, and imported sponges sit neatly beside carved basins. Servants press collars until they gleam stiff as armor. To be clean here is effortless, because someone else sweats for it. Then you retrace your steps into the working districts. The contrast stings. Children sleep 3 to a bed, their bodies pressed together for warmth, lice, and coughs spreading like gossip. The air smells of damp straw, smoke, and unwashed bodies. A cat slinks across the rafters, scattering soot onto a cradle below. In these streets, clean doesn't mean spotless. It means less dirty than yesterday. Light joke to soften the weight. You imagine a job interview in Victorian London. The employer doesn't ask about references or skills, just lifts your cuff to see how white your shirt still is. Pass the collar test, and you're respectable. Fail, and you're suspect. That's resume and deodorant all in one. The night closes in, lamps sputtering through the fog. You stand at the threshold where 2 worlds meet. One glows with polished brass and lavender water. The other groans under coal dust and sour laundry. Hygiene here is not universal truth. It is privilege, performance, and survival, all depending on which side of the street you call home. And as you turn away, the smell of soot clings to your coat, while the echo of perfume lingers faintly in your hair. 2 scents, 2 worlds, braided together in a city learning, slowly, unevenly, that cleanliness was never evenly distributed. You follow the street lamps into the shadow of a looming hospital, its brick walls grim and window panes glowing faintly. Inside, the air is sharp with carbolic acid and the iron tang of blood. Hygiene here carries the highest stakes of all. Step into a ward, and you'll see rows of narrow beds, patients swaddled in bandages, nurses moving briskly between them. Yet behind the order lies chaos, for in the Victorian hospital, infection lurks like an uninvited guest. A mainstream fact: before antiseptic practices took hold, post-surgical mortality was staggering. In some hospitals, nearly half of patients undergoing operations died from infections like gangrene or sepsis. Surgeons wore the same bloodied coats for years, treating them like badges of honor. Instruments were wiped, if at all, on the surgeon's trousers. Imagine lying on a wooden table, chloroform mask pressed to your face, while someone with unwashed hands prepares to cut. You shiver, even under the warmth of the gaslight. But change is coming. Joseph Lister, a Scottish surgeon, begins experimenting with carbolic acid in the 1860s, spraying it on wounds and instruments. The sickly sweet smell fills the ward, stinging your nose as mist settles over bandages. Infection rates plummet, and suddenly, the idea of sterile technique doesn't sound like superstition, it sounds like salvation. Quirky tidbit: the carbolic spray devices hissed so loudly and soaked the air so thoroughly that patients sometimes coughed and complained more about the treatment than the surgery. Still, it was progress, even if it left the room smelling like a chemical factory. Historians still argue whether Lister's methods spread quickly because doctors believed in germ theory or because desperate hospitals were willing to try anything. Some surgeons scoffed, calling the sprays unnecessary. Others embraced them with near religious fervor. You picture rival camps in hospital corridors, one waving flasks of carbolic, the other rolling eyes while quietly losing patience. Beyond the operating theater, the wards themselves are battles against dirt. Nurses scrub floors with hot water, open windows for fresh air, and insist on laundered sheets. Florence Nightingale's reforms during the Crimean War echo here. Her belief that cleanliness, ventilation, and order save lives. You run your hand over a freshly starched sheet, still faintly damp from boiling. It crackles like paper, and you think, cleanliness here isn't cosmetic, it's life or death. Yet the reality is grim. Rats scuttle in the corners, drains stink, and water supplies are often contaminated. Hospitals for the poor are overcrowded, beds jammed so close you can hear each patient's rasping breath. The rich, of course, summon physicians to their homes, where illness can be hidden behind lace curtains and lavender sachets. Hospitals are for those with no choice. You drift into the surgical theater. Gas lamps flare against whitewashed walls, and wooden benches rise around the table. Students crowd in, eyes gleaming, notebooks ready. The patient moans faintly, chloroform mask clutched in place. The surgeon lifts his knife, steady but unwashed. The room falls silent, save for the drip of carbolic solution and the scratch of pens. You swallow hard. Even with antiseptics, survival is uncertain. Without them, it's a coin toss with death himself. Light joke to break the tension. You imagine a Victorian Yelp's review for hospitals. 1 star. Doctor's hands not washed. Bedbugs complimentary. Carbolic mist gave me a rash. Would not recommend unless desperate. Sadly, most patients didn't have the luxury of leaving reviews, or of leaving at all. Yet progress seeps in, brick by brick. Sterilization becomes more common. Surgical instruments gleam brighter. Bandages are boiled, nurses trained. Mortality rates drop. The smell of carbolic lingers, but behind it, you sense hope. Hospitals shift from houses of dread to symbols of modern medicine. You step out into the night, wiping the sting of disinfectant from your nose. The stars blur faintly through the fog, and you realize that Victorian hygiene wasn't just about baths, perfumes, or laundry. In the wards of hospitals, it was the fragile line between life and death, between a world ruled by filth and a world inching toward sterility. And tomorrow, you'll step into the most private world of all, where sweat, silence, and unspoken taboos reveal how Victorians coped with intimate hygiene under layers of corsets and modesty. You step away from the echo of hospital wards and into the muffled hush of a drawing room where curtains filter the lamplight into something soft, almost conspiratorial. Here lies the unspoken territory, the private matters of bodies, sweat, sex, and the silence wrapped tightly around them. Victorian hygiene in this realm wasn't shouted from rooftops. It was whispered behind closed doors, or not spoken of at all. Corsets creak as women bend, tugging laces until breaths shorten. Layers of chemises, petticoats, stockings, and skirts wrap the body in a fortress of fabric. You can feel the warmth trapped beneath, the dampness gathering after a long day. Bathing fully may happen once a week at best, but undergarments, those thin shields, bear the brunt of sweat. Mainstream fact, laundering underclothes regularly was considered essential even for the poor, because it was easier to wash linen than skin. A crisp white chemise signaled cleanliness, though it didn't mean the body beneath was freshly scrubbed. And yet, bodies do what bodies do. You shift uncomfortably, imagining the reality of summer heat in London under 4 layers of wool. Deodorant, as you know it, didn't exist. Instead, perfumes, powders, and the occasional dusting of alum under the arms served as makeshift odor control. Quirky tidbit: some guides even suggested wiping underarms with vinegar or cologne-soaked cloths, creating a scent somewhere between salad dressing and eau de toilette. Not quite alluring. Historians still argue how Victorians truly managed intimate hygiene. Advice manuals were coy, avoiding blunt language. Euphemisms about personal freshness and delicate health hint at routines too modest to spell out. Doctors sometimes prescribed vaginal douches, not for contraception as much as for supposed cleanliness, though the solutions ranged from mild soaps to outright dangerous chemicals. The subject remains half-lit, glimpsed through medical journals and whispered memoirs. You wander into a bedroom. A corset lies across a chair, whalebone stiff, fabric yellowed with sweat. Nearby, a chamber pot hides beneath the bed, discreetly veiled by a curtain. Privacy was relative. Many couples shared close quarters with children or servants just a wall away. Hygiene had to adapt to proximity. Whispered silences, perfumed handkerchiefs, discreet nighttime rituals, all smoothed over the inescapable truth of human odor and bodily needs. For men, body hair and beards carried their own burdens. Thick whiskers trapped food and sweat. A well-groomed mustache might be waxed daily, but washing it thoroughly? Rare. You picture a gentleman leaning close in conversation. Cologne clouding the stale scent of ale clinging to his breath. A gallant appearance, a questionable aroma. Light joke to soften the air. You imagine a Victorian Valentine's card. Roses are red, violets are blue. I haven't bathed lately, but my chemise is new. Somehow it fits. The silence around sex itself was perhaps the loudest hygiene story of all. Manuals stressed purity, modesty, and restraint. The body was meant to be controlled, not indulged. Sweat was unmentionable, desire even more so. Prostitutes, meanwhile, were demonized as vectors of disease, especially syphilis, the specter haunting Victorian bedrooms. Attempts at Contagious Diseases Acts sought to regulate and examine women, never the men who visited them. Hygiene became morality, morality became control, and the silence deepened. And yet, intimacy still happened. Couples found their way past starch and silence, their bodies pressing together despite sweat, corsets, and the faint sting of vinegar-soaked cloths. The human drive refused to be blued out like a collar on wash day. Behind the layers of repression, warmth persisted. As you step from the dim bedroom back into the hallway, you realize Victorian hygiene wasn't just about dirt and soap. It was about what could and couldn't be spoken. Sweat was hidden with powder, sex wrapped in euphemism, odors drowned in lavender. Silence was as much a part of cleanliness as soap itself. Tomorrow, you'll step into the light again to see how plumbing, science, and social change slowly pulled hygiene toward something more familiar, toward the modern idea of being truly clean. You leave the shadowed bedroom and step out into the pale light of a new morning. The fog curls low over rooftops, but something feels different, lighter, cleaner. By the later decades of the Victorian era, the tide begins to turn. Hygiene, once a luxury or a moral sermon, becomes a practical reality, reshaping daily life in ways you can finally recognize. Down the street, pipes are being laid, bricklayers bend, hands red with mortar as they set the arteries of a modern city. Water now flows through iron mains instead of buckets from public pumps. Flush toilets appear in middle-class homes, their porcelain bowls gleaming like pale thrones. You lean against a lamppost and watch a boy pull a handle, eyes wide with pride as water rushes down. The old cesspits and chamber pots haven't vanished overnight, but the future is audible in the gurgle of drains. A mainstream fact: by the 1890s, large parts of London were connected to Joseph Bazalgette's intercepting sewers, reducing cholera outbreaks dramatically. Death rates dropped, and suddenly, public health campaigns had tangible proof that sanitation saved lives. The Great Stink had forced the issue, but the decades afterward delivered results. Inside a chemist's shop, shelves gleam with new products. Soap is cheaper now, mass-produced by companies like Peers, advertised with colorful posters of cherubic children. You smile at the familiar sight. A bar of translucent amber soap, marketed as both gentle and modern. What was once a luxury is slowly becoming a household staple. Quirky tidbit: Pears Soap ran one of the first global advertising campaigns, even sponsoring art competitions to tie cleanliness with culture. Imagine buying soap not just as necessity, but as aspiration. Historians still argue whether this shift came more from science or from savvy marketing. Was it Lister and Pasteur convincing people germs were real, or was it posters and slogans convincing them soap was modern? Probably both, braided together like the ropes on a wash line. You continue walking. Bathhouses still operate, but now more homes have bathrooms of their own. Middle-class houses sport tiled floors, running taps, and even hot water tanks. The ritual of laundry, though still exhausting, is aided by new detergents and improved wringers. Tooth powders give way to early pastes. Toothbrushes now come with celluloid handles instead of bone. The pieces of modern hygiene are falling into place, one invention at a time. Socially, too, the meaning of cleanliness shifts. Where once it was moral virtue, now it's tied to modernity and science. To be clean is to be advanced, to step into the 20th century with polished boots and brushed teeth. Even the poor benefit from public health reforms, with cleaner water, better waste disposal, and schools teaching children to wash hands. Light joke to soften the lecture. You imagine a Victorian slogan: soap, now with fewer arsenic side effects, pasted across a city wall. The progress might be uneven, but it's progress nonetheless. By the time Queen Victoria's long reign draws to a close in 1901, the world feels different. The smell of sewage no longer dominates the Thames. Soap is affordable. Bathrooms are more common. Hospitals embrace antiseptics. Perfume and powder still veil imperfections, but behind them lies genuine cleanliness. You breathe in, and for the first time in this long walk through history, the air smells almost fresh. You stand at the threshold of modern hygiene, looking back at chamber pots, knit combs, carbolic sprays, and vinegar-scented underarms. The journey has been gritty, sometimes laughable, sometimes grim. But it has led here, to a world where washing daily isn't a luxury, but an expectation, where clean water flows with the turn of a tap. And now, as the lamps flicker low and your eyes grow heavy, it's time to let the images fade. The night slows. The noises of the city soften to a murmur, like the hush of water slipping quietly through new pipes underground. Imagine the Thames at dusk, no longer a stew of filth, but a broad, steady mirror catching the glow of gaslights along its banks. The air is cooler now, tinged with lavender instead of sewage, and it carries a promise of tomorrow's freshness. Your breath eases, clothes hang on a line, swaying gently in the night breeze, their starch forgotten, their whiteness unimportant. A faint fragrance, soap, rose water, or maybe nothing at all, lingers at the edge of memory. Sheets crackle softly as they settle, no longer heavy with lie, just waiting for the warmth of sleep. You picture yourself in a quiet Victorian bedroom. The fire burned low, a basin of water stilled on the stand. The candle flickers, then fades, leaving only the hush of silence. Outside, the city rests, soot settling, drains carrying away the day's troubles. Inside, you curl beneath heavy covers, the weight grounding you, the air calm at last. Let the rough edges of the day smooth out, like starched linen. Let the noise of history ebb into a steady lull. Soap, steam, powder, and perfume all drift into the background until only the rhythm of your own breathing remains. And with that, the story closes, not with a bang, but with a sigh, carrying you gently towards sleep.